Michael, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to talk to you. I think, well, first off, congratulations on writing the book, The Comfort Crisis. I've really enjoyed it, and I think it's just so necessary for our time. And I think it's almost a pretty obvious idea, but it's an obvious idea that I don't think enough people are talking about. I think in the time we live in, we are just inundated with taking friction out of our lives, whether that's apps that deliver our food to our house or all these different things that we use technology for to essentially make life simpler. But there is a cost to, not having those discomforts in our lives anymore. But I'm curious, we'll jump into more details around that. I'm curious why you wrote this book. Why did you feel like you should write it, and what brought you to this place to do it?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So my background is I've been a health journalist my entire career. I worked at Men's Health for a long time on staff, and I'm still a contributing editor there. Do a lot of stuff for Outside and different publications. And I basically observed that anything that tends to improve humans' health and well-being, mental health, physical health, etc., usually comes with going through some form of discomfort, right? So if you want to improve your fitness, you're going to have to do some workouts. Working out is uncomfortable. If you want to lose weight, let's say, you're probably going to have to be hungry. And so I sort of made this observation and filed it away. And then I had some experiences in my career where I met a guy whose name is Donnie Vincent. And Donnie Vincent is sort of this far out character. He's a backcountry bow hunter and filmmaker, and he makes these hunting documentaries that are sort of like Planet Earth, but with hunting. And so he invites me to come up to the Arctic with him. And I go up. We're going to be up there for like a month. And this experience, like, I'm a writer. I sit behind a desk, like, yes, I work for Men's Health, so I had to do some uncomfortable stuff in my career. Like I trained at, some hardcore gyms and all that kind of stuff. But we get up there and this is like completely threw me out of my comfort zone in every single way, right? It's like you mentioned today that today it seems like a lot of people sort of know intuitively, like, sometimes we have to go through discomfort for benefits. But I think today that often gets framed in the sense of like, I went to this gym and was on the elliptical for a while, or I took an ice bath. No, we've like removed discomfort from our life in every single way. Like our lives are just so different, right? So when I go out in Alaska, all of a sudden it's like, I'm hungry the entire time because you can only pack in so much food. Every single thing we do out there takes so much effort. It's like we're carrying these 80-pound packs everywhere, just going down to get water so we can, drink to not die and also cook our food.
Right.
We have to hike down this like mountainside, carry these big jugs of water back up to camp. And there's also like grizzlies hang out down by the river. We face crazy weather. Even just being outside in solitude and in silence is like so different than our environments today. So I got back though, and I'm like totally transformed. Like I just felt better than I'd ever felt. Like physically I was, 10 pounds lighter. I was way fitter than I'd ever been in my life. And granted, I worked at Men's Health for years and was trying like all this stuff that was supposedly like the secret,
Right.
But no, just carrying heavy shit for
Right.
30 days will do that to you, And I sort of thought back to that observation I made about discomfort, and having been out in the Arctic where everything was challenging and effortful and uncomfortable, it made me realize how different our environments are today. And then I kind of wondered, okay, well, how has this tip into comfort that we've taken really affected us? And so then that sort of set off a journey around the world where, I read all the research I could on the topic, thousands of studies, old government documents, ancient texts, and traveled the world meeting different experts, like people like researchers at Harvard, doctors at the Mayo Clinic, special forces soldiers, just all kinds of far out characters who are all, I would say, sort of in their own way, looking at the downsides of certain forms of discomfort or the downsides of certain forms of comfort, and how we can sort of take back our bodies and minds by engaging with certain forms of discomfort that our ancestors faced like every single day.
Right. Man, there's so much there to unpack. I think to start, you mentioned something, and I do think there are lots of pieces of that I want to dig into. But one thing you mentioned is like the solitude of that trip, and one thing I think a lot about now, and it's something I'm kind of obsessed with, is just the noisiness of the world, to where I almost can't even a lot of the time focus on. It's like the comforting thing of just like the apps on my phone, of social media, all these things. The noise itself has become so comforting that you can't even hear your own thoughts. I'm curious for you, was that a big part of it too? Like the mental aspect of it, going up there, not having stimulation in the same way, where you're just like, damn, I'm just staring at the same dirt or snow or whatever you're hiking through, and just like that stimulation is such a huge part of our lives now, especially working behind screens all day. What was the mental side of that like for you?
Totally. So we were up there hunting caribou, and the way that you hunt caribou is you're basically waiting for them to come through on their migration. Now we had 3, 4, 5, 6 days at a time where we would not see a single caribou. So we're like sitting on these hills waiting for these animals to come through who are not coming through. And my cell phone is totally useless. I didn't bring anything else. And all of a sudden it's like I got reintroduced to boredom, which is this thing that like we rarely feel anymore. So boredom is an evolutionary discomfort that basically tells us that whatever we're doing with our time we're not getting enough out of our time. Like the return on our time invested is low. So this used to tell us things like, let's pretend that, back in our past, we were picking berries off a bush. This is the example I use in the book. Well, we would pick all the easiest to pick berries first, right? And then all of a sudden the berries become harder to pick because they're way in the back of the bush or whatever. Well, boredom would kick on and basically say, hey, like what you're doing right now you're not getting as much as you need. So we'd go do something else to help ourselves survive. So it's kind of this thing that kicks on and tells you, hey, do something else. And usually that thing was something more productive. Well, now we have this super, super easy, effortless escape from boredom in the form of screens. So especially our phone. It's like anytime we feel this discomfort, we can just whip out our phone and it like solves the problem. But it's not really productive, right? Because we're no longer going like, oh, here's this thing that's going to really improve my life. We're like, oh, here's this video of this cat on Instagram, right? So getting reintroduced to that was really fascinating. And what happened is like, just like I explained, it's like it's uncomfortable at first. You're like, what the hell am I doing? Why am I up here? But then your mind sort of starts to zone out, starts to mind wander. And mind wandering is actually associated with improved mental health because it gives your brain some downtime. So it's really, that was also an interesting aspect. But then, instead of having this easy, effortless access to a screen, I would maybe write some of the book or come up with some other idea X, Y, Z. Like I just was on this totally different wavelength of ideas. And it was super beneficial. And this is also why when they do research on boredom, they find that people who have been bored and are bored come up with better, more creative ideas than people who are constantly stimulated by screens.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious to I think that makes total sense for me. I've been trying this thing where I wake up and I don't look at my phone for the first few hours of the day. And it's crazy how much more focused I feel when I don't do that. It's like you scramble your mind up first thing in the morning. And so you can't focus on any one thing. It's like, I'm looking at the Lakers score and they're getting defeated. And then you're looking at all these other things in the world, politics. You're just getting infiltrated with all these different trains of thought. And they're these parallel tracks that are breaking off in your mind to where there's no one singular way to focus. And so there's something really damaging about that too, of just never finding peace of mind and peace with just being present in the moment. And so what sounds really interesting to me is like, so how long did it take for you when you were out there for that discomfort to kind of go away to where you were just kind of settled in and nestled into the boredom, where you were more comfortable with it maybe?
Well, I think that it tends to come in waves, right? Like once I would find some solution for it, whether it was writing part of the book, coming up with I came up with like an entire Christmas list, for everyone and just crap like that. But eventually, like whatever you're doing, eventually that starts to become boring because your time invested is like your return on your time invested starts to drop off. Like with writing the book, eventually it's like the writing starts to get crappy and your brain sort of realizes that. So it's like, let's do something else,
Right.
So I don't think you ever really solve for boredom, because if humans as we evolved could have solved for boredom, there wouldn't have been an incentive to keep improving our lives in these harsh environments. Like, we wouldn't have gone out and hunted and gathered and done whatever else we could to survive. So like, it's always going to be there. But I think to your point about like this fracturing of our attention, I think that's the important part. Is we used to have these moments of mental downtime where the activities we would do would be more beneficial, but like we would spend more time, I think, engaged in them. And I think that what media has done is really just make us a lot more scattered, going from like point A to point B to point C way quicker. So it's hard to keep our attention focused on one thing. And I also point out in the book, like you hear so much information and advice about how to use your cell phone less. And it's all good. Like we all know we need to be on our cell phones less, but your brain does not know the damn difference between the screen on your cell phone and the screen on your television and the screen on your TV and the information being streamed into your ears, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This all takes your attention in a way, right? So I really think about it more as you just need more boredom. Don't think less cell phone, think more boredom, because the problem is when if you put down your cell phone and you just go watch Netflix or go on a computer, which a lot of people do, it's the same thing, Sure. Yeah. So we need to think more boredom, and it's like, not everyone, and by not everyone I mean probably no one, is going to go up to Alaska for a month like I did to really rediscover boredom. And I'm not saying you should, but I think there are ways that you can do this in your life. Like, you've found this way of like, I'm not touching my cell phone or whatever for at least an hour or whatever. I mean, I'll take walks in the afternoon, a couple times a day, short walks, maybe like even 15, 20 minutes where I just don't take anything. And I can like get outside and just have this time where I'm slowly walking, and it's forcing me into inward thinking, which a lot of times our attention is so much more outward today.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. I'm curious, you said you had talked to many professionals in writing this book. You had mentioned like professionals from Harvard. I'm curious more the science behind the mental side of this. What have you noticed about or what were some observations you made about the science of what's going on in our brains during all of this? Is there anything there that you could share?
Yeah, for sure. So to make it less annoyingly dense and complicated in the book, I basically describe it as your brain has two modes, focused mode and unfocused mode. Okay. So focused mode is any time that your attention is focused on anything in the outside world. This could be a conversation you're having with someone. This could be you're driving and you're having to pay attention to the road. It's also, if you're listening to a podcast, if you're focusing on this information right now, you are in outward focus mode. The other mode is unfocused mode. And it is when you are mind wandering, essentially. You're not thinking of anything in the outside world. You're thinking internally. Now, mind wandering, when you start to mind wander, your brain goes into this mode called the default mode network. And it's essentially a sort of rest mode. So when you're focusing outward, your brain is actually working pretty hard when you're like having a conversation. But when you have this time where you go inward, like have these random different thoughts, gives your brain this rest period that allows it to kind of rest, revive, reset, process this complicated information that you've taken in from the outside world. And because we're turning so much information over to digital media, our brain is spending less and less time in this inward, restful, restorative mode. And this is part of the reason why things like anxiety and burnout are so high today.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, the sorry if you hear that siren.
Yeah, no worries.
I'm right in the middle of Manhattan, and there's
Nice.
someone angry. So that's normal here. But anyway, yeah, I think for me, like, I've noticed, in my past, I've struggled with depression personally. That's been something I've dealt with. And I noticed that more time spent with technology and digital information, the more, I think less of that. It's strange. I almost feel like my mind, it gets more exhausted more easily the more technology I'm using. Even though it's stimulated, it's hyper stimulated, by like the end of the day, I just feel like exhausted. And it almost exhausts my, depressive tendencies if I'm on it too much. And I do think you simplifying it down to these two modes really helps me, because I do find if I'm spending more time in the second mode, the restful mode, I feel a lot better in this very, I don't know, simple way. It's just I feel better, feel less depressed, feel all these things. I wonder how, you said it brings up anxiety, it brings up depression. I'm sure that things are just skyrocketing in that world right now too. I know those numbers are they maybe at their highest ever? Do you know those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely at the highest since we've been measuring them. And especially with the introduction of smartphones really did it, because all of a sudden, like, you saw them rising with things like, TV and media and radio. And then when we got our supercomputers in our pocket, it's just like, bam, there it goes, especially with, I think social media has added to that as well. But yeah, the numbers are higher than they've ever been. I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but like, especially among college kids, I mean, it's like, the rate of anxiety and depression among college kids who are in college now versus I think like year 2000 is, I mean, it's like tripled across the board. And it's crazy. I mean, so I'm a professor at UNLV, and I teach a health journalism class. And when one of those assignments that I have students do, I have them write this, feature about where they can, really just dig deep on a topic. They can write about anything in the health sector. Literally, like, half the class wants to write about how their cell phone and social media are making them depressed and anxious. It's crazy. Right. It's like, we all know intuitively that this stuff is not great for our mental health. And yet we keep coming back. And it's like, okay, well, why is that? It's because there are people who, for a living, figure out how to keep our attention on these things, because that's how they make ad revenue, right? Totally. And it's like, we have this hardware that used to be beneficial for us in our past. It's no longer serving us, because you have, like, Stanford and MIT geniuses figuring out algorithms that just keep us hooked,
Right. Yeah, 100%. I come from the media world, like, previously from here, and I've said this a few times on the podcast, but the formula I like to say is, the media exists, like, basically the formula is to identify a problem and then make that problem everyone's problem and have them read it all the time. And so that's why, more than ever, we know the crazy news that's happening 10,000 miles away from us in an instant. Even though we were evolutionarily, our minds were never designed to contain all this information all the time. Like, we were not supposed to know what's going on. We're supposed to be able to survive, like, keep our family safe or whatever. Like, and I find that really, really interesting. I'm curious. I mean, we've talked a lot about the mental side of this, which is really interesting. But I'm also curious about our bodies, because in so many ways too, there's so much going on, and there's always a lot of, like, health and diet fads and all these things that are popping up all the time. And what I've become more interested in my own personal health journey is just, like, what has worked over evolution, for as humans and what seems to have worked. What have you learned about that side of it? Like, is there anything, diet, nutrition, what we drink, what we eat? Like, I mean, that's a huge part of comfort in the modern age. It's just like, I think of sugar off the top of my head, and things like that. Like, what did you learn about that?
Totally. So it was interesting because when I was in the Arctic, we were packing in about 2,000 calories a day. Because food is heavy, you can only pack in so many, but we're probably burning like 6,000 to 8,000 calories. So I lost a lot of weight, and I was hungry the whole time. You know what I mean? And when we would eat, it was like the best part of the day.
Right. Yeah.
It's because food is rewarding. We evolved to have these internal mechanisms in our brain that reward us, not just for eating, but particularly for overeating. And especially if that food is calorie dense. So the more calorie dense a food, the bigger shot of dopamine we get in our brains. Now, this used to serve us because when there wasn't enough food around, if we could binge on something like honey or something like meat and gain weight, that would serve us the next time like we couldn't find enough food. Right. Well, nowadays we're swimming in food, and it's all engineered to be super calorie dense and really rewarding internally. So the most calorie dense sweet thing you find in nature is honey. And it's very hard to find. And to get it, you have to climb a tree and you have to square off with some bees, right? It's not an easy task.
Sure.
Well, nowadays it's like we have so many foods. Like the average food in the grocery store is way more calorie dense even than honey. And it's all cheap, it's all accessible, and we don't have to do anything to get it, right?
Yeah.
So we've engineered these environments where, I mean, more than 70% of the country in the U.S. is either overweight or obese. I'm shocked it's not higher. I mean, it's supposed to grow, but it's like, it's really a wonder that it's not higher. But what I think is interesting is having, done a lot of reporting on nutrition at Men's Health is like, we have this whole diet industrial complex, right? It's like, we hear studies where it's like one day it's like carbs are what are making us fat. Right. The next day it's like, no, fat is actually making you fat. One day it's meat is bad for you. Meat's going to kill you. The next day, no, meat's fine. Meat's great for you. You need to eat more meat. The reality is this. It's like when we're talking about something in a weight loss context, it's calories in, calories out, like physics, right? Now, the question isn't, and the thing is that like all diets work. Doesn't like pick keto, whatever, low fat, Mediterranean. I don't care what it is. They will all work if you follow them.
Right.
Most people stop dieting after 5 weeks. So the question becomes, well, why the hell can't you follow it? That's where hunger comes in. So when I experienced hunger in the Arctic, I started like looking into the science of hunger. And what happens is our bodies and mind pull all kind of interesting levers to essentially get us to eat more to gain that weight back. And like 98% of people who lose weight in a given year, they gain it all back. Right. So your body will do things like they'll start to slow down your metabolism, but really it will increase your hunger signaling. So like you have bigger cravings. So the rate limiting step for most people is that they can't deal with the discomfort of hunger. So I traveled down to Austin to meet this dude, and he's his name's Trevor Cashy. He got his PhD when he was like 23, graduated college when he was 18. I mean, he's a super genius. And now he runs this place called Trevor Cashy Nutrition. And he is more concerned about why a person eats rather than what they eat. Because again, you can really eat, so long as you're controlling calories, you can eat anything and lose weight. You just have to have the right number. But it's like you have to find something that's consistent for you. So a lot of what he does is just simply making people aware of how much they're eating. Because nowadays it's like no one really knows how much they eat, right? It's like when you look at the studies, people miscalculate. People who are overweight tend to miscalculate by about 1,000 calories a day. I mean, that's huge, right? When you should be eating 2,000 calories. So he does that by having people like measure things and also helping them deal with stress, because we're more stressed out in the modern world, like we were just talking about, for various reasons. And food is a really easy way to deal with stress. You eat that food, you get that dopamine shot. It's like, oh man, I'm good to go.
Right.
But then you're going to get stressed again, so you're going to eat again. So it's like thinking about, how do I manage all this? So in the book, I really get into sort of the science of hunger. How do you manage it? And then also, how do you think about managing your stress in a way that is more productive than eating a Snickers? Now, eating a Snickers is easy and effortless and it's delicious, don't get me wrong, but do that over a lifetime and you're going to probably have some health problems down the road.
Yeah, for sure. What are some ways of managing stress better?
So one thing that he has people do is try to be aware of your patterns. I'll give you an example from my own life. I would get home on Fridays and I would sit down at my computer and I would start to sort of write some final emails for the week. And it was like, oh man, week's over. I was kind of like, felt like I was like offloading the stress, and I would like just mindlessly eat like peanut M&Ms and like my wife's like kettle corn. And I was like, why am I doing this? I'm not even hungry. And he's like, he just asked me, well, what happens on Friday? And I told him, I was like, well, I told him what I just told you guys. It's like, I felt like the week was over and I could reward myself. And it's like, oh, I'm not eating because I'm actually hungry. It's just because I feel like I am rewarding myself. So then he's like, well, why don't you deal with offloading stress by doing something calorie negative, like go for a walk, whatever. And that gives you some time to realize, oh, I wasn't hungry in the first place. You're also like burning some calories,
right?
Another way is to simply, all foods, so long as you eat them within reason, seem to be okay. But the reality is that calorie dense, ultra processed junk food is not going to be as filling for you over time.
Right.
They do studies where they put people, they allow them to eat whatever, but like one group will only have mostly unprocessed food. Another group will have processed food. Well, the processed food group always eats more calories because the stuff just isn't filling. Right. So thinking about like, what are the most filling foods? And it's the stuff that humans have been eating for thousands and thousands of years. The most filling food you can eat is just plain potatoes, right? And then from there, like very basic staple grains, things like vegetables, and things like lean meats. It's like that kind of a diet. The reason it works for weight loss isn't because there's any magic that you heard from some wacky diet book. It's just that it is more filling over time, so you just end up eating fewer calories.
Yeah. What's interesting about that, I'm trying to bulk up a little bit, but I'm trying to do it clean. And it is hard. Like normally I'm a garbage disposal. I can eat and eat and eat. But doing it clean, eating whole foods that aren't processed, it's so much harder to reach the calories, the proteins, all that stuff. It's so much more filling to do it clean. And I was very surprised by that, personally, because I'm used to just being like, yeah, totally. You can knock out a few thousand calories a day, no problem. But that's if you're eating shit.
Totally.
If you're eating clean, you get full much quicker.
Yeah, totally. It's funny because I know a guy who was he was a nutrition guy, and he was working with someone who was like a bodybuilder. So he just had to eat a ton of food. I mean, like 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day. And the guy was like you. He's trying to eat it all clean. And because the food is so like filling, he just couldn't do it. And the nutritionist was like, I need you to just smash a Domino's pizza. Like that's going to make your life so much easier. Just please do this. And once he started doing that, it made his life easier, right? Yeah. But the reality is that guy is like 1 in 5 million people. The rest of us need to avoid that Domino's pizza and 100%. Eat more of the whole stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if you're a competitive bodybuilder, you get a pass there. But if you're, you're just like an average Joe, try it out, crush a Domino's pizza for fun. When in talking about all this, it's interesting because we're talking about technology, media for our minds, and then technology for processed foods and what we eat and consume now. In a certain sense, would you say the book is almost a critique of technology outpacing the human species and the human mind? And like, is technology in a certain sense almost a villain in the story, or is there a way that we can be compatible? Because it almost feels, I'm sure you saw The Social Dilemma with Tristan Harris. And when you think about it, it's just like these crazy AI machines up against our one little fragile human brain. It feels very daunting to think that you could actually beat it. It's almost like a game.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is technology not just in media and social media necessarily, but just technological advancement in the human species versus what our minds have evolved to be. Are we kind of at odds with that?
I think, look, like here's the deal, is technology is amazing, right? Mm-hmm. You and I are having this conversation. You're in New York. I'm in Las Vegas. Las Vegas in June, it was 111 degrees yesterday, and yet I didn't burn to death because my house has air conditioning, right?
Yeah.
I don't have to go run down my food like I would have had to in the past if I was hunting. All this stuff is amazing. Now, I think really the problem is that we have this internal wiring that always tells us to do the most easy, effortless, most comfortable thing. And that used to serve us in these environments where life was inherently uncomfortable. Life was inherently challenging. Everything took effort. Like, it used to save us, keep us alive. You know, it told us to like overeat, told us to not waste any effort. It told us to do the least risky thing we could do. It told us to be afraid of as much as we could be afraid of. Mm-hmm. It doesn't serve us anymore now that our world has tipped into one where everything is effortless, easy, and we've made everything comfortable. Now, this started to happen particularly around the Industrial Revolution, and really once it started taking off like about 100 years ago. So I don't necessarily think that technology is like a villain always. I just think that we don't know how to balance it because we have these internal drives. Like we always listen to these internal drives that we evolved to have, which only makes sense. Like you can't blame us. So I think really it's more like we need to be aware of what's happening and figure out ways to sort of offset these environments that we live in. And that also allows us to enjoy them more. You know, it's like if you never get out of this like cycle of like Netflix and processed food and soft bed and all this stuff, this shit is amazing. Mm-hmm. Like full stop. But we often just like don't appreciate it because we never like have the ability to pull back and be like, oh man, yeah, this is amazing. I don't have to like do anything super crazy for my food and I don't have to sleep in the rain tonight and et cetera, on and on, you know? Right. So that can make us slightly insufferable in our daily lives. I mean, this is why we have first world problems, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's so simple to lose the gratitude of how actually incredible things have become for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's also, you know, when it comes to like the internet and technology, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, using using the internet before it uses you. Like it's this amazing, incredible tool that if you harness it correctly, selfishly for whatever purposes you have, writing blogs or doing what I'm doing, making podcasts or whatever thing you want to do, getting your message out there with your book, all these different things. Like I think if you use the internet before it uses you, or if there's like a good balancing of it, it's like the most incredible equalizer ever for just people being able to thrive. Mm-hmm. But it's just if you're only, you know, the input versus output balance has to be there. If you're just constantly on input and you're just getting your brain drilled with 1,000 things or 100,000 things all the time from the digital world, you're just setting yourself up for a flabby kind of way of living. Yeah. So
well put. Yep. I like that.
What for you? I'm curious some ways, you know, and we've kind of established the big problem. Have you seen any big transformations? What are some things you've kind of observed or some practical takeaways for like how do we get uncomfortable? And what are some modern ways that you've been kind of seeing in some examples maybe from the book that you could give me?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot, right? The book covers a handful of different discomforts that we essentially evolved to face that we've removed from our lives. So because we just are segueing from sort of media and the internet, I think that I already talked about how boredom is so important. Well, another thing that we've lost is we don't go outside all that much anymore. We spend about 95% of our time indoors. Now, we evolved in outdoor environments, and we know now from years of research that being outside is really good for our mental and physical health. Now, the reason we spend so much time indoors is because it's more comfortable. It's safer. The human brain always it will default to a place that's going to make it feel safer, feel more comfortable, etc. So we don't really have a ton of incentive to go outside. But after being in Alaska, so I'm up there and, there's grizzlies, everything is hard. The weather is freezing cold. You would think that I would be stressed out and flipped out the entire time. Mm-hmm. Well, actually the opposite was true. I was the most calm and centered I'd ever been. And I'm why the hell is this? So I get back, and I go meet with this nature researcher. She's a neuroscientist, and her name is Rachel Hopman, and she is doing research on this concept called the nature pyramid. And it basically tells us, it's kind of like the food pyramid. It basically tells us how long we should spend in nature, what different doses of nature we should have. And there are essentially 3 levels to this pyramid. The first level, it basically says you should spend at least 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week, outside in nature that you can just find anywhere, like in a city park or whatever. For you, that'd be like Central Park. At the second level, it basically says that we should spend 5 hours a month in more wild nature, like something you can find in the state park, right? So for you, this might be okay, I'm going to take a train up to somewhere on the Hudson and I'm going to go for a super long hike once a month. The very top, there's this concept called the 3-day effect. And this is, it basically says that once a year, you should spend 3 days in as wild of nature as you can. So this is backcountry stuff, the place where there's only trails, no roads, you're embedded and you're there for 3 days. Now the first 2 levels that I talked about, they're really associated with improvements in creativity, decreases in stress, less depression, less anxiety, more fulfillment in life. Once you get to that top pyramid, what's really interesting is that Rachel will take people out into the woods and she'll bring this complicated brain, neuroscience gear, and she'll measure their brain waves. And when people first get there, having come out of the city, they are riding what are called beta waves. These are violent sort of go, go, go frenetic waves like we tend to ride nowadays. But once you have them on their 3rd day, if they haven't had access to tech, their brain starts to ride alpha waves. And these are found in experienced meditators. They're very calm. They sort of reset your focus and your mind and just make you more fulfilled and more gratuitous in life. It's amazing. So essentially the takeaway is that 3 days a week in the backcountry is sort of like a meditation retreat, except there's not all the stuff that goes along with that, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I think that that's one way, is just more time outside. But it has to be without your cell phone, because if you have your cell phone during any of these doses, it cancels all that out. That's why I take those outdoor walks, like I mentioned before. Reintroducing ourselves to hunger, like I sort of talked about before. It's people aren't hungry anymore. 80% of eating, when you look at the data, is driven by reasons other than real hunger. It's because we're stressed. It's because it's a certain time of day. It's because XYZ. Right. So having reintroducing yourself to hunger through a variety of ways. Some people will fast for a little while, which I think that that's just a good thing to do. So you realize this is what hunger actually feels like. Okay. It's not actually that bad. Right. I think nowadays we just eat because we're anxious about something else,
Totally. Yeah.
In terms of, physical activity, it's we have to move 14 times less than our ancestors did, right? And when we do when we do exercise, now they didn't exercise. This was just life for them. Totally. So we had to invent exercise to offset our lazy lives, more or less. But when we do exercise, it's we go into a temperature controlled gym and we get on this elliptical and do this weird motion that you'd never see. And then we go lift these perfectly balanced weights that we've pre-selected, okay, I'm going to do this X times.
Right.
Don't get me wrong, it's good for you for sure, but it's unlike anything we've ever done. So when I was up in Alaska, after we kill this caribou, we have to carry it out. And this was the hardest thing I've ever done, So, my bag, I've done a lot of like physical stuff, and this was definitely the hardest. We had like 100 pounds in a backpack, had to walk it across the tundra for like 5 miles, mostly uphill. The tundra is hell to walk on. So it took us like 5 hours packing this thing out, and it just crushed me. When you look at how the human body evolved and why we're built the way we're built, there are basically 2 reasons. The first is to run there's a few reasons, but the main ones are that we evolved to run long distances in the heat. This is how we would hunt. So we're basically some of the only mammals that walk on 2 legs, right? And we would run down animals in the heat because we're really efficient at cooling ourselves, where most other mammals are not. We're not really fast sprinters, but we can run slow a long distance.
Yeah.
And we would eventually keep bumping the animal. Eventually it would overheat, and then we'd spear it and cut it up, and we'd have dinner. But then we'd have to carry that animal back to our camp. That's the second thing that we're really uniquely good at. We're the only mammals that can carry. Yeah. Well, other animals, they have to drag something, and they suck at it. It's really inefficient. We're amazing at carrying. These are like the 2 things that made us human, more or less. Now, a lot of people still run. Not many people carry stuff for a workout, but it turns out the carrying is probably a lot better for us because you're getting you're getting endurance because you're covering ground while loaded down. But 2, you're also getting strength work, right? Because it's the weight just forces more exertion from your legs, from your torso, from even your shoulders. And it's super uniquely good for us. And I traveled I learned that from researchers at Harvard, and I traveled down to Jacksonville, Florida, where I met with these special forces soldiers, because they're really the only group of people who have put carrying at scale through rucking. Like, rucking is the form of fitness of the military. And if you don't know
what is rucking?
It's walking with a weighted backpack. That's like how they train in the military. So they'll put like weight for the sake of it in the backpack and just walk, because when they're on missions, they're a lot of time carrying pretty heavy gear. And they've teamed up with doctors at the Mayo Clinic who are prescribing rucking to patients because it's a lot less injurious than running. Like, because of the way we now live, a lot of people can't run very well.
Sure. Yeah.
We're also pretty heavy people, so that's not great for our joints. But rucking is like exceedingly safe, and you also get the strength element. And it's super easy. It's just like throw some weight in a backpack and go for a walk. So you can, like, if you normally walk the dogs, just throw on a backpack with some weight, and all of a sudden it becomes way more effective and good for you. So that was an interesting one as well. Yeah, there are a handful of others. I can go on for days about this kind of stuff.
No, man, that's so interesting. And I've never even really thought that much about the rucking or the carrying aspect of it. But that's true. There aren't other animals who do that. They might carry in their mouth for short distances.
Right.
But I'm curious, this is kind of off from the subject, but it's also not, because it is a discomfort. I mean, had you hunted before this trip?
I had not, no. I had been on hunts, but I hadn't been the actual hunter.
I'm curious. I've been thinking about this lately. What was that like for you? Being actually, I'm not sure if you or the person you were traveling with actually killed the caribou. I'm curious what that experience is like. I think that and it kind of ties into the comfort discomfort thing, because I think, I can walk down to Whole Foods and I can buy my beef or my bison or whatever. And I'm so disconnected to the process of like what it actually took to get that meat. And that it was a living creature that was once there, I'm really curious that because I've never hunted, I've never killed anything, except ants. So I'm curious for you, like, what was that experience like? I've heard in the past, you kind of gain a new level of respect for the animal you kill and things like that. What was that like for you? Yeah,
so we had, I had planned on going up there, and Donnie tells me, hey, you should hunt. And I was like, I don't know if I want to, just because I'm a journalist and, I'm not supposed to get involved in the story. But I think I was telling myself that because, I knew there'd probably be a pretty heavy emotional barrier that I would have to cross.
Yeah.
Now, I was not at all anti-hunting if someone was using the entire animal. Like I can see that like there's not really that much of a difference if I'm just, my barrier to entry is swiping a credit card and they're actually like doing the deed, if you will. Yeah. But I have, some reservations going in, and the guy just says like, hey man, I think you'll really understand why we go up there and do this if you hunt. So I say, okay. And, we'd been looking for caribou for, at least a week or two at this point. And we get in a position where we see this herd and they're across this like big valley. We're on one hill, they're on another hill, and they start moving sort of down the valley, and there's going to be a saddle they're going to cross. So we're like, okay, if they continue on this path that we think they're going to be on, if we can get to the other side of that saddle, sort of get in a good position as they cross the saddle, we'll be in a pretty good position. So it's like, all right, let's go. And like, I have the rifle. I'm still in the mindset like, do I really want to do this? Like, right. Man, I was there to hunt. I had bought a hunting tag, but I'm still hesitant. And we cross the saddle. We kind of like nuke across the tundra, and then we get down like army crawl. We kind of crawl 100 yards, can't see anything. Another 100 or 200 yards. We see these antlers appear at the apex of the saddle. And there's like, one pair, two pairs, three pairs, all of a sudden 30 pairs. And Donnie, who I was with, he was right at my side. He's got binoculars. He's looking at him, and I'm looking down the scope of the gun. And both at the same time, we see this one caribou who's limping, and he's definitely old. It helps we only hunt older stuff because that can actually improve the health of a herd, whereas, killing a younger caribou can do the opposite. So this thing's limping, and it's like, okay, this is it. And they, they're at like 300 yards. They're walking closer to us 200 yards. We get to 150, and I'm like, he keeps going in and out of this herd. And then they get to the point where they're closest to us, and they kind of start walking away. And Donnie's like, hey, man, if you don't want to shoot, you don't have to shoot. But if you're going to shoot, you need to do it right now. And I'm looking, and then like kind of right in that moment, it like opens up, and there's a clear shot, and I take it. And then I shoot again. And the caribou falls, and like right after that, I'm like, oh my God, like, what have you done? Like, I just felt terrible, and we walk over to it, and Donnie's like, hey, I'll go get our stuff. He kind of leaves me with it. And I felt like as depressed and alive as I've ever felt before. It was like, it was the craziest feeling ever. Like a lot of regret, but also something like very human or something. I don't know. And, but I was also like, I'm never doing this again. Like I'm never doing this again. And, then when Donnie came back and we started breaking down the caribou, my mind sort of shifted because, all of a sudden this goes from like this majestic animal on the tundra that I've sort of put a human story behind, like, oh, I've taken it away from its family and that kind of stuff. And I start to see that, it's meat as well. And it's like, I eat meat like all the time. And never once do I have a single feeling. It's just like, oh, I just eat it to eat it. That's what you do. Right. And so I wonder like, well, why the hell don't I feel this way about any of the meat I eat, right? And I think that gave me a huge amount of respect, not only just for that animal, but for like all the meat I eat, and made me really think about meat differently. So you would think as someone starts hunting, they would eat more meat, right? That only makes sense. I eat less meat now because I sort of realize the heavy emotional burden that goes through that, and that there really is, you start to realize, oh, this is part of the life cycle, and you have a little more respect for that. And so now I think I will hunt again because I feel like for me there's something behind. I don't know if the word is like rewarding or what, just more, I don't know, behind hunting your own meat rather than, if you have the opportunity to rather than buying at a store. Nothing wrong with buying it at a store. Like the reality is we have, 8 billion people on planet Earth, and
Right.
not everyone can hunt. But I do think we also need to sometimes rethink how meat is raised at a grand scale,
Sure, yeah, of course.
for sure.
I just think it's such a beautiful picture of the disconnection we've kind of been talking about, of like how disconnected we are from the results of our current reality. Because you telling that story, I'm there with you, and it's really difficult I can't to actually think about, killing another living thing, but then also watching it turn into something so useful. And there is like this level, and I guess respect is just the word I keep thinking of, that you just do not acquire through the meat counter at Whole Foods that you do out there in the wilderness. And you get to keep that forever, and you're going to think about it differently forever. And so I don't know. I think there's something really special about that, but also just like kind of illuminating about the reality we live in, about wow, we don't really see things, how the sausage is made, for lack of a better terminology,
Yeah. And that's engineered, right? It's like there is a reason that we use certain words to describe cuts of meat in a way that are like, don't remind you that it came from a living thing. Think of how like meat is presented, where it's just like already cut. It's in this like styrofoam thing. It's very shiny. It's like you're not reminded that it came from a living thing. It's because death is uncomfortable, whether it's through eating something, that you killed, or even thinking about your own death. So that's another thing that I talk about in the book, is like, we just don't want to face death across the board. This goes from our food system to our funeral system. Even you think about how what happens after someone dies in the U.S. It's like we make them look as alive as possible for an hour-long viewing, and then it's like they go into the ground, and then what are you told? Yeah, take your mind off it. Like you don't want to think about it. And to sort of learn, I guess, what happens when you start to like face the fact that you're going to die one day. I traveled to Bhutan, and Bhutan is one of the least developed nations on Earth, but it also consistently ranks among the happiest on Earth. And one of the things they do, there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is that they have a very intimate relationship with death. So death is sort of like woven into their culture, and this goes from everything from like their myths to a lot of their cultural traditions to how they handle funerals. I mean, even things like across the country, there's these little clay pyramids that are made with clay and ashes of the dead, and they're like everywhere. I mean, when I say everywhere, they're like in every windowsill, at every road turn. I mean, they're all across the country. And the people in Bhutan are reminded to think about their own death at least once a day. And so I met with a few different leaders there who basically described it as, once you realize that you at some point are going to die, you don't know when, could come anytime, it starts to change your behavior. All of a sudden, like, if I know I'm going to die, I'm probably not going to get as worked up about like some random dude cutting me off in traffic or cutting me in a line, and it starts to really help a person focus on that which is going to truly make them happy. So this is one of the reasons why they seem to be happier. It's like, you're like, I'm gonna die at some point. I'm gonna do what I know is gonna make me happier, because I got, theoretically this one shot at it. And they've actually followed up with research in University of Kentucky. I think Stanford has done some research that basically shows that when people think about their death, the exact same thing the Bhutanese are talking about happens. Those people who've thought about their death report being significantly happier than those who haven't taken it into their life and been aware of it. Now, that's an uncomfortable thing to do. Yeah. It is. But like all things, by going through some discomfort, you come out the other side improved.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think, I've read I like stoicism, some of the books on that, and that's really a heavy theme. It's just like the reflection on death. And I think that, for me personally, I think the pandemic has probably, and everything that's happened over the past year and a half or so, for me personally, it's absolutely created this new urgency. Because if anything, I just feel, I think it's very tempting to think we're going to live forever. especially when we're not faced with like having to fight grizzly bears now, in nature. It feels like we're going to live forever because our lives are so comfy. So we don't fear it and think of it the same way. But man, yeah, for me, I definitely, that really resonates because I know personally, the more I accept, the acceptance that I will die eventually, someday, could be tomorrow, could be 100 years from now. I don't know. But like that acceptance, it creates this level of urgency and clarity of like, I'm not going to waste my life doing bullshit that I don't want to do. And that's really cool that culturally, that's what you found there. That's really, really neat. Wow. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, and that's a pretty big theme of the book, is just the fear of, is that kind of a big core theme? It's just like the fear of death is really kind of what we're all afraid of facing in a lot of ways.
I think so, but I think also that is sort of like the core thing, this survival mechanism, right? We have, but the problem is like, it used to be that as we evolved, like we would have to do these big, challenging, risky things all the time just to survive, whether that was like, moving from our wintering to our summering grounds and there's a storm coming in, or whether it was like a big epic hunt or like sort of tiger lurking in the bushes. And so we had fears of those things because those used to be dangerous, but every time we would do something and, whatever, we would learn something about ourselves and we would come out the other side an improved, better off person with expanded capabilities. Well, nowadays it's like we've engineered all sorts of like real risk and challenges out of our lives. And so now we have this outsized fear of things that like in the grand scheme of things aren't really all that challenging. So this is like, I messed up, I had a misspelling on slide 7 of a Word presentation and my boss gave me a bad look. And like, that's what I'm afraid of. Like, it's like, oh man, that was terrible. And so we have like we have an outsized fear over things that aren't really that dangerous or a real threat to our safety or survival. Yeah. So one of the things in the book I talk about is this idea of misogi. I meet this guy whose name is Marcus Elliott, and he's a Harvard-trained doctor and super far out dude, but very brilliant. He runs this facility called P3, and his background is that he gets his MD at Harvard. He decides he's going to go in sports science. He gets this job with the Patriots in the early 2000s. He drops there, and he uses like really interesting data and science to sort of figure out the root of hamstring injuries. He drops the team's hamstring injury rate from 26 a season to 3. They start winning. He opens this P3 thing, and they do this like movement data modeling to show how to improve player performance and also reduce injury risk. So he's super into data, numbers and figures and science, but he also realizes that like what improves humans can't always be measured. So he does this thing called misogi, where he like is trying to mimic these challenges that we used to face in the past. So he'll get like his friends and some pro athletes, and they'll go out and they do one really hard thing a year. And there are only 2 rules to misogi. It's got to be really hard, which means like 50% chance that we're going to make this and be able to do this. And then number 2 is that you can't die during misogi. So they'll do things like one year they carried a rock 5 miles under the Santa Barbara Channel, this 85-pound rock. So one guy would dive down, walk like 10, 20 yards. Next guy would. And after 5 hours of doing this wacky thing, they've made the 5 miles. They'll do things like, we're going to pick the farthest mountain peak we can see, and we're going to try and make it there in just a single day. Now, what he's doing is he's mimicking these challenges that our environment used to naturally show us. Because along the way with this 50-50 shot, you're going to be put in a position where you're like, I don't think I can do this. I think I have to quit. But by putting one foot in front of the other, or whatever it is, you learn that you're a lot more capable than you actually realized. And so when you get to that end, when you get to sort of the edge of your comfort zone, and then you walk across it and realize, well, shit, I'm still alive.
Right.
All of a sudden that edge is at a new place, right? And so you've improved yourself. And so then when you go back into your everyday life, all of a sudden, when on slide 7, you've misspelled that word, you're just like, fuck, I don't care.
Right.
This is not important. Yeah. It's just like, whatever. So it's kind of like a reframing of that helps you function better in the sort of weird modern world we have now. It teaches you a lot about your potential and what you're capable of.
Is there a way, have you done that? Have you tried that yourself?
I have. I've done some. So kind of like Alaska, my trip up there was almost its own big misogi because, like, you know, I'm a writer. Like, okay, I've written for some like big health and fitness magazines and done some shit, but at the end of the day, I sit behind a desk clacking at a keyboard, right? So more than a month in Alaska, I mean, there was a lot of times where I like thought I had reached that edge, kind of go over it, and then it's in a new place, and again and again and again. So when I get back into, you know, life in Las Vegas, all of a sudden, like, just a lot calmer, feel a lot more capable. Like, all of a sudden, it's just like kind of a reframing. And I try and do one every year now.
Okay. What's on deck for this year?
Well, I just did one in April. So the idea, again, the rules are that it has to be really hard. So 50-50 shot. Yeah. Like true 50-50, because people are always going to like err on the side of being able to complete it. 2, don't die. And then the guidelines are that it has to be kind of kooky, just made up. Like, don't pick a marathon, because a lot of times people will, they do stuff just because other people have done it and they want to compare themselves to others. Like, it's not about comparison shopping. And then number 4, the guideline is that you shouldn't advertise it. Like, you know, don't blast it on Instagram, do all this stuff. So I'm kind of breaking number 4 by talking about it, but just in the interest of like helping people understand it. So I had never run more than 16 miles in my life. And I thought, okay, like, what would be a good one? Let's do like some sort of trail run. And thought, well, could you do double that? I thought, that would be pretty hard, but I think I could do double that. So that felt like a better shot than 50-50. So it was like, all right, well, what about triple it? Shit, I don't know if I could do triple that. I mean, that's 48 miles. That's a run.
Yeah.
So I went and tried to find out. Just went out into the desert. I found this trail that was 12 miles long. It was out in Red Rock Canyon, Las Vegas. And all right, 4 laps. Let's go. And lap number 3, I was like, nope, not finishing this. This is messed up. Like, there's no way I can do this. And I finished that lap, and I was like, all right, we're going to try for 4. We're going to just try 4. What's the worst that can happen? I have to walk back.
Right.
And I did it, you know. And you have this moment in there where it's like, shit, like, I've like sold myself short on this. It's like, what else am I selling myself short on? Right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is like, all of a sudden you feel like, I mean, you have this moment where you're like, damn, it's good to be alive, right? Like, a lot of times the world can be sort of muted, colorless, because we tend to like live in these homes all the time and Netflix and Snickers and whatever. You get out and do something like that, and it's just like, it just ignites something that's just so much different and more like, all of a sudden, like, the color gets turned up to like Technicolor color, 100%. You know what I mean? Yeah. And it's just super, just very life-giving activity to do, I think.
100%. Did you train for it?
No, that's the other thing is, I mean, if it's 50-50, it's like, if you train, all of a sudden it's not 50-50.
Wow. So 48 miles untrained, you just went for it.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing is like, as we evolved, I think that it would make a whole hell of a lot of sense if people evolved to have an undersized appreciation for what they were capable of, and to really, but to be overly capable should they get thrown into a situation. So it's like, you want people, if you want to spread your genes and DNA, you want people who are like, I don't want to do anything risky. I don't think I could do that. No way I could do that. But if they were thrust into that situation naturally, to have them be overly capable, right? So you don't want people who are like, oh, I could do that for sure. And then they get out there and they just fail hard. They're just totally incapable. So I think everyone kind of has this mechanism inside them that often just doesn't get, you know, used today. Yeah. So it's like, and I really like, I think that what's awesome about this idea is that not everyone's 50-50 is going to be the same.
Right.
So for me, I'd run that 16 miles, right, before. But for someone who's only run 3 miles, well, do you think you could do 5?
Right.
I could probably do 5. Well, what about 7?
Right.
Shit, I don't know about 7. Okay, well, go find out.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I love that. What can you find out about yourself through that? I mean, we don't have to talk about him too long, but I do know, like, it reminds me of David Goggins, and he's like the most extreme crazy guy example. But
Yeah.
what he said has really stuck with me about, like, when you feel like you're completely out and you're done, you've just hit 40% of what you can actually do. And that really sticks with me. I think it might be closer, like you've hit like 60, 70%, and David Goggins is a psycho who it's 40.
Yeah.
But it's true. I do think that there's like this level that you hit, and it's just your mind telling you you're done, but your body can just keep going. And that's really, really inspiring. And it's just
I think so.
And it builds it builds your self reputation. You didn't go out and run all those miles for anyone but you. And it's just like, man, you get to walk away thinking like, oh my gosh, what else can I do? What else can I, like, that's so cool.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that the once a year thing is important too, because if you try and do this all the time, you're going to hammer yourself, right?
Yeah, right.
So just the one time a year, it's like, don't overthink it. Just go do something awesome. And it's like this nice annual reset.
Yeah, I like that. Awesome. Well, I think that's a cool place to wrap up, Michael. Where can people connect with you? Where are you online? Where can people connect?
So my website is eastermichael.com. I'm on Instagram at Michael_Easter. And then the book is called The Comfort Crisis, and it's available wherever books are sold.
Yeah, awesome. I'll put a link into the show notes for all that stuff. Man, it was great talking to you. Really enjoyed it. So thank you so much, Mike, for being on.
Yeah, it was well. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Dude, that was great.